We here at the UU Fellowship of Columbus are an inclusive spiritual community of people who support each other in their personal searches for truth and meaning. I'm Ron Ussery, your volunteer service leader. We start our services by lighting the chalice, which symbolizes reason, tolerance, and freedom, and also justice, compassion, and love. The remark about compassion and love reminds me of yesterday's meditation services and Buddhist studies led by Joni Anderson over here in the circle. And in the Buddhist studies, we talked a bit about Vladimir Putin and how the Buddhist mindset would have us react to that sort of situation. And a bit surprising to me, I guess it shouldn't be, is that Buddhist studies would remind us that we are all one. We have much in common with all other humans and all other things, and that we should always remember that even Vladimir Putin is part of us, and we are part of him. So we should respond to him with love. That is a challenge, isn't it?
Today's reading is in Singing the Living Tradition, and it's a responsive reading. So I'll ask you all to turn in the back of the book to 602. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. This reading is in honor of our speaker, who was raised until a pretty young age in China. And so this morning's reading, it comes from Lao Tse, or Lao Tzu, depending on which authoritative source you read. He is a purported or a possible author of much of the Tao Te Ching. And this morning's reading is, if there is to be peace, I will read the regular type, if you'll read the italics. If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is peace in the home, if there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart.
Thank you, Bill. We are grateful to be here now. We are grateful for the volunteers who serve us every week to make this service possible. We support this spiritual community as contributors in our own way. And now we offer everyone a chance to support the maintenance of this facility and the grounds we all enjoy. Sure.
Just wanted to give a brief blurb about the offertory. It's Robert Schumann's Papillon, Opus 2, numbers 1 through 4. There are a total of 12 of these short character pieces. Papillons translates to butterflies. So I just thought it was very good timing for this piece, as this week we're having daylight savings, next week the first day of spring, and then over the next few weeks I'll play all 12 of them. But this morning I'm going to play the first 4. Hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Whittaker. Now for our main event, I'll introduce our speaker. Jacob sent me his CV, as I requested, and I have to tell you that if I were to read everything on the CV, we wouldn't have time to hear his remarks. So I'll have to be abbreviating it some. There are so many honors and accolades here that we don't have time to get to all of them. But he was born, as he'll tell you, in Tianjin, China, immigrated to the United States in 1951, and was naturalized with his parents in Montgomery in 1957. His wife of 41 years is Claire. His son, Joshua William Biel, practices with Jacob. Jacob went to Columbus High School. He went to Mercer University, attaining an A.B. degree in history and political science, and graduated magna cum laude. He won all sorts of awards, all sorts of awards at Mercer in undergraduate school, as well as in law school. Just among some of these things, that his most salient awards include the Algernon Sidney Sullivan Award, the highest university award in 1967. He was in the Blue Key National Honor Society, the Sigma Mu Honor Society. He was accepted to the Harvard, Yale, Columbia program. He was in Dean's List 3 years. Summer intern under Senator Richard Russell in 1965. Then he went to Walter F. George School of Law at Mercer, graduated in 1970 with his J.D. cum laude, of course. Admitted to the Georgia Bar in 1970, which is a significant milestone when you consider that that's over 50 years ago. Admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1977. He was assistant city attorney in Columbus back in 73 to 75, and he was a partner from 73 to 88 in the law firm of Hirsch, Biel, and Parton. He's been in sole law practice since 1988. He was in active duty in the U.S. Army beginning in 1970 in the Adjutant General Officers Program. He was assigned to the John F. Kennedy Center for Military Assistance at Fort Bragg. As a civilian service leader, he's been a member of the Board of Trustees of Sharif Israel Synagogue, including being a vice president of that board. He was a member of the board of the Columbus branch of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, also a board member of the Arthritis Foundation, Columbus Hospice, the Lung Association, so on and so on. With the Mercer University Alumni Association, he served as every officer, including president. Ditto with the Columbus Lawyers Club. He's chairman of the board of visitors at his law school. Among his numerous other awards, he's earned the Meritorious Service Award from Mercer University Alumni Association, the Humanitarian Award from Columbus Hospice, and the Pro Bono Award from the Columbus Lawyers Club. Please help me welcome Jacob Biel.
Thank you very much. If you can't hear me, which is not the normal, let me know. All continuing education programs start off with a story. And in that tradition, I'm going to tell you the story about this symposium about when life began. And it had a Catholic priest and a Methodist minister and a Jewish rabbi. And they asked the Catholic priest when life began, and the Catholic priest said, at conception. Then they asked the Methodist minister, when did life begin? And he said, when the child became viable. And then they asked the rabbi, when did life begin? And the rabbi said, well, it's when the dog dies and the children leave home. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my second time in front of your group. The last time was probably 20 or 30 years ago, and it was at your old facility. I think that's on Double Churches Road. And I think Ed Wilson was the one who invited me to come. I don't know if these 20 or 30 years is a reflection on the fact that they didn't like what I said or the way I said it. Anyway, I want to go back historically, and as Mr. Ussery said, I did get a major in history and political science, continue to read history late into the night after doing my homework from work. And so I'm always been interested in history since I was a little guy in elementary school. In March of 1881, Tsar Alexander II, who came on the Russian throne in 1855, was riding back from the Field of Mars, which is a parade ground in St. Petersburg. And he was going down the Ekaterinskaya canal when a bomb was thrown. And the bomb bounced kind of away from his carriage, because it was a carriage given by Napoleon III, and it was reinforced, and it was for protective use of him. So he got out. Several people were hurt, and he got out and to check on them. And when he got out, somebody ran up to him and says, "Is Your Majesty hurt?" And he says, "Thank God, no." And there was an assassin right in front of him who said, "It's too early to thank God." And he threw another bomb and killed the Tsar. The reason I mention that is because the Tsar was supposed to sign a constitution for Russia that very day, that very Sunday in March of 1881. His son was a notorious autocrat and reactionary, Alexander III, and came to the throne, tore up the Constitution, and basically started a return to an autocratic system that continued through the reign of his son Nicholas II until the Revolution. He basically, in May of 1882, instituted the May Laws, which were very, very anti-Semitic laws, and ultimately they were proposing that 1/3 of the Jews in Russia die, 1/3 basically leave, and 1/3 convert to Orthodoxy. That started the first great wave of immigration to America amongst the Eastern European Russian Jews that came in the 1880s, 1890s. Sometime during that period of time, my family, my paternal family, immigrated to China because they felt there were better opportunities in China. There was a large Russian community in China, especially in Manchuria, where the terminus of the Russian railroad was. I don't know how my maternal family got to China, but they did. Excuse me. My mother's parents' father was from Lithuania, and my mother's mother was from Galicia. Galicia was that part of Poland that was taken over by the Austrians. And in fact, in World War I, it was really fought over very heavily between the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians on the Eastern Front. How they ended up in China, I don't know. But ultimately, my father was born in 1921 in Manchuria, which is right on the Manchurian-Chinese border. It was a horrible time. The Civil War was going on in Russia. Thousands of people were dying. There were pogroms all over the place in Russia and in the East. My father was, I think, 12 pounds, and grandmother was like 5 feet. She was very small. He was very large, almost killed her in birth. The doctor, from what they told me, was drunk. He was born in a railroad car, so it was a very hard time, very, very difficult time. He survived, they survived, and ultimately they ended up in a place called Tianjin, or Tenzin as is anglicized, which is the port of Beijing. It's not on the ocean, it's on the river. So the ships would debark right there in the ocean on barges, and the barges would go up the river to Tenzin, where they were uploaded or unloaded and go into the mainland. Tenzin was and still is a very, very industrial city. It was noted for carpets, and one of the exports was pig bristles. Can anyone tell me what the pig bristles were for?
Hair brushes.
Brushes, exactly. And so it was a commercial center. There was a large community of Jews there, obviously more in Shanghai, and in other larger communities all over China. Harbin was in Manchuria. It was the terminus of the Russian railroad, and the Russians built that city. And even if you go there now, you'll see the imprint of the Russian neoclassical style buildings all over Harbin. And that is where my mother was born in 1922. She was one of 3 girls, and the youngest was still being nursed by my grandmother when there was some sort of altercation. Grandmother went out the door, gunfire, and she was killed. So she left 3 girls orphaned, and her sister took care of the 3 girls, and they moved to Tsingtao. Tsingtao is on the Shantung Peninsula. It's where the Chinese Navy now is one of its headquarters. The Germans, after the Boxer Rebellion, got Tsingtao. That was their territory. And they built the town to the way it is now. Very structured, very beautifully built. And in fact, if you go to a Chinese restaurant and order beer, you'll get Tsingtao beer because that's where the brewery is and still is in Tsingtao. The Germans built the brewery and it's still being operated. But that's where Mother grew up and where she and her 2 sisters went to school. They didn't have school for what they call whites. That was what the Chinese called Europeans. So she went to school in a Catholic convent for the whole time, from 1st grade to 12. And by the time she was graduating, Tsingtao and most of the coast of China was invaded and occupied by the Japanese. The Japanese had already occupied Harbin. And Harbin, after the Russo-Japanese War, became a sphere of influence for the Japanese. And of course, they invaded China in 1937. So these were very tumultuous times. The Manchu dynasty ended in 1908. And so you had a horrible period of civil unrest. You had these warlords who took over sections of China and ruled it. You had a central government under the nationalists, and then you had a growing Chinese communist group led by Mao Zedong. In 1927, the nationalists decided to get rid of the communists and had deadly reprisals all over China against the communists. The communists, including Mao Zedong, went on the Long March and left the eastern part of China and went into the hinterlands and stayed there until they won the Civil War and came forward going to the east and winning the Civil War in 1949. Harbin, interestingly enough, had a strong Russian community, including a lot of white Russians who had escaped from the Civil War. And there was a lot of tension between the white Russians, who were basically very anti-Semitic, as they were in Russia. And they had outbreaks of violence against the Jews in Harbin. We didn't experience that in Tientsin because there wasn't a very strong presence of white Russians there. And if there were smaller groups of white Russians in Tientsin. An interesting story, I guess, is the fact that a Jewish merchant owned the Hotel Moderne. It was one of the nicest hotels in China and in the East. And the white Russians decided that they would kidnap his son, who was a very noted musician. And they started cutting off his fingers and sending the fingers one at a time for ransom. Ultimately, they found him dead. The Japanese didn't do anything. They controlled him. They controlled Harbin. But that gives you an indication of what was going on, the tension in Harbin. In Tientsin, my grandmother ran a boarding house. My father grew up and went to the Jewish school there. There was a very fine Jewish school. In fact, they often were very proud of the fact that they took the entrance exams there to go to Oxford. It was the same exam as Oxford University in England. So there was a very fine school, very good, and they even had, was not a Boy Scout group, but it was a paramilitary group that was very Zionist-oriented. So they're already Zionist, and Israel was on their minds at that time as well. They had a very good life in China. No matter how poor you were as a European, you were richer than the Chinese, most of the Chinese. So my parents and my grandmother, we kind of lived together in the same house until I was born. But they had servants, a chauffeur, a cook, a housekeeper, and I had an amma. An amma is a nanny, and she was with me from the time I was 3 months old to the time we left when I was 6. She stayed with me. She slept in the room with me. She was just a really very wonderful person to take care of me. But she hobbled. Do you know why she hobbled? Yes. She had been born before 1908, and her feet had been bound. So she hobbled, and every night she had to soak her feet because her feet were bound and arthritis had set in. She ultimately went to stay with my mother's sister in Tientsin, and ultimately her son came for her and took her back to the small village where she had been born and lived. The Jewish community in China was exceptionally vibrant. They had the Kunst, that's I think German for taste, Kuntes. That was the club, and they had a movie theater in there. Had eating facilities and banquet facilities. And the synagogue, if you go on your Google and put synagogue Tientsin, the synagogue is still there. Of course, it's not used as a synagogue anymore and hasn't been. But the building is still there, and I remember it as a child. It was a beautiful synagogue, and it was built in the 1930s in the Art Nouveau style, and it was unique. Now, it was an Orthodox synagogue because everybody in China was principally Orthodox. And the women sat upstairs in the balcony with the children, and the men sat downstairs. So it was a unique synagogue. Then there was a cemetery. There was a bakery below for baking matzah for Passover. So it was a very, very self-contained community, even during the Japanese occupation. Now, the Japanese left us alone. We were stateless. We had no nationality, even though we were Russian by background. So we had no nationality, and the Japanese left us alone. Because if you remember, Russia didn't come into the war until the time in August of 1945 between the first atom bomb and the second atom bomb. That's when they came in. So the Japanese left us alone. The Germans tried to encourage them to do something, but they did not do anything with the Jews. If you were Dutch, American, British, or French, the Japanese would intern you in camps all over China. Depending on the commandant of the camp, would depend on how the camp was handled in terms of severity of people and whether or not it was a bad camp or a tolerable camp. There was one in Tianjin. We were not in there. But if you were one of the Allied people in China and was caught up, they would be interned there. The rest of the population just had to go by the rules the Japanese imposed. There were rules against black marketing. There were rules against dealing in war materials. There was you couldn't listen to a Voice of America. You had to be very, very cautious about what you did. And if you weren't, the Japanese would behead you. That was basically their means of punishment. So those years were not easy, but they were not obviously as bad as they might have been had my family stayed in Europe. As soon as the Japanese lost the war and left, the civil war started in China between the nationalists and the communists. Ultimately, the communists won. I remember as a kid, this is 49, going into the basement because they were fighting over Tianjin. Now, we were not afraid of the communist soldiers. They were extremely well trained. Mao Zedong said that if you took a door down in a peasant's house to sleep on, you put it back the next day. He knew that you won the respect and affection of the people who you were in the area you were in by treating them with courtesy and not harming them. In Tianjin, we were mainly concerned about the nationalist soldiers because they were in panic. They were retreating. They were trying to get rid of their uniforms. It was just not a very good time for them because they were losing the Civil War. I remember them putting shards of glass on the wall around my grandparents' house to keep anybody from coming over the walls. We were in the basement, which was also a coal cellar. And ultimately, the nationalists lost. And excuse me a minute. And the communists won. And that was a tremendous change. They would come once a week and check. They would talk to the servants to find out things about you. You know, you certainly didn't listen to the Voice of America. And they started taxing the whites or the Europeans. And they started taxing you to pay back your servants and your employees what they thought you should have paid them for years and didn't pay them. It was at that time that we decided that it was time to go. And the whole family and the whole community started moving out. They would go to Israel when my grandparents went. My father's brother went to Canada. We ended up in America. My mother's sisters ended up in Australia. So the whole community broke up and went wherever they could. Claire and I were in Israel about 3 years ago, and interestingly enough, in Tel Aviv, there's a synagogue dedicated to the Jews of China. And there in that synagogue are the Sefer Torahs, which is the scrolls from the synagogue in Tianjin and other Jewish communities there in that synagogue in Tel Aviv. My cousin, Fred Landis, was bar mitzvahed with those synagogue Torahs on the ship taking them to Australia. Well, actually Israel first. Recently I've heard from him. He called out of the blue, and he is, I think, almost 80, 81. And so the whole community is slowly dwindling away that ran away from China and the community they had. We came to America because my great aunt, my father's aunt, my grandfather's sister, she did not leave Russia with my grandfather. She stayed with my great-grandfather in a little place called Smila, which is a town in the Ukraine. And the Ukraine experienced horrible pogroms, which were outbreaks of violence against Jews. Between 200,000 and 300,000 Jews died in Russia, especially in the Ukraine, during the Civil War in Russia from 1918 to 1921-22. And tragically, my great-grandfather was murdered in Smila. And Anna, his daughter, my great-aunt, was was protected and saved, she first hid in the chimney, and then ultimately she had a horrible time. My grandfather came from China and got her. She suffered through famine, and it was just a horrible experience for her. She never talked about it. She ultimately ended up in China and was raised by my grandfather almost like a daughter and almost like a sister to my father. She met and married an American soldier because after the Boxer Rebellion, the Americans also, besides the French and the Russians and the Germans, were in China. And the 15th Infantry was in Tianjin and stayed in Tianjin until about 1937 when the Japanese invaded China. She met and married an American soldier, had a child there, and came back to Phoenix City and Columbus. And we lost touch with her during World War II, obviously. But after the war, we reestablished a connection, and she brought us to America. And she was the one who sponsored us to come here. We came here in 1951. Was a big experience for a 6-year-old kid. We went from Tianjin to Hong Kong and spent 3 months there in Hong Kong waiting for our papers. The communists would not have let us go had they known we were coming to America. So we had papers stating that we were going to Israel. And when we got to Hong Kong, we switched the papers and got the American papers that we had wanted. They immediately knew about that, and they went and arrested everybody they could in my father's office because they said that they were complicit in what was going on. It was, again, not an easy time. We got on a steamship, which was a Danish freighter, with about 15 passengers, including the 3 of us, and we went all the way from Hong Kong to the Philippines to San Francisco, and then took the train from St. Louis, from San Francisco to Birmingham, and then from Birmingham we took the Greyhound bus to Columbus. We landed there where Countries is now, downtown. And we lived in Phoenix City for 7 years. And then my father passed away in 1958, and we moved to Columbus, and that's where we lived other than going to Mercer and going into the Army. I've been back since 72 practicing law. Mother passed away in 1983. My aunt, great aunt, passed away, not 83, excuse me. She passed away in 2006, and my great aunt passed away in 2005. We never knew how old Anna was because every document she had a different age on it. She was very vain, very short lady, very vain, and just very feisty. And every document, even her citizenship paper, had erased the date of birth and had a different date. We think she probably died, she must have been 103, 104. And she was just a unique person. And I was lucky to have 2 mothers instead of just one. Questions?
You're good.
I'm good?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Dean, where in the world today do you consider Jewish persecution to be the biggest threat? And second part, do you see that growing in the U.S.?
That's an interesting question. Anti-Semitism for the last 10 or 15 years or so has really grown all over Europe. It's coming back very strong in France, and it's gotten very strong over the last 4 or 5 years in America. I don't know if you realize it, but we get reports all the time about the growth of anti-Semitism in America. Without offending anybody, I always tell people that, when you lift a manhole, you don't know what's going to come out of the sewer. And I think that was done in November of 2016, in terms of the election of Trump. So I think the manhole was uncovered, and then you have these people coming out of the sewer that of all sorts of political persuasion, and most of them are very, very fanatical. So, I never thought that we would move from America, but Claire and I talked about that and have talked about it. It's frightening to think that again, the Biels would have to go again after leaving Russia and China to leave America, but it's out there. I don't know if you see it or hear it, but it's out there, and it's getting stronger and stronger. Some people basically say it's very strong in the universities. Some people say it's there because of the fact that they're anti-Israel. Well, I understand not agreeing with Israel. I don't agree with everything the Israelis do. But a lot of times being anti-Israel is a smokescreen for being anti-Semitic. So it's there. I don't know what's the most dangerous place, but it's the growing anti-Semitism is very frightening. You know, you'd think that after World War II and the Holocaust, you know, it would go away, but it hasn't. It's just always under the surface.
I think right now the most dangerous place for the Jews is in Ukraine.
Well, you know, that's always been a dangerous place for Jews. The Ukrainians have never been hospitable to the Jews. Nothing against the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russians, but they have never been. That's where we live. It was the Pale of Settlement. Do you know what the Pale of Settlement was? It was the area in Russia, I think I may have already said it, that the Romanovs allowed the Jews to live in. If you, without special permission, you couldn't work outside the Pale of Settlement if you were Jewish. You couldn't go to school outside, etc. They limited the number of Jews in universities, if any, and that Pale of Settlement is where they lived. Most of them lived in very abject poverty in the shtetls, so little communities that they lived in. So the Ukraine was very, very harsh to the Jews. It was harsh during the Civil War in Russia. Obviously, they helped the Nazis. I don't know if you knew about that, but the Ukrainians were very, very collaborative with the Nazis in World War II.
I think what's happening in the Ukraine is very unfortunate, and I feel a lot of compassion for the victims of that conflict. You know, Marcus Aurelius said that no one should be surprised when a fig tree produces figs. And we're fortunate to have someone like you who is so knowledgeable. Do you think that humanity just produces misery? Is what's happening in Ukraine consistent with history? And, you know, we talked about there must be peace among nations. Is that ever going to happen? Do you see peace in the future?
I think my most positive feeling about that was when communism fell and you had apartheid fall. In the same time, I felt really positive and optimistic. But, you know, Russia has gone back to where it's always been, which is an autocratic state. I mean, I think it's tragic that their 10 or 15 years of democracy just faded away with Putin. But as far as, I don't really see peace coming. It's very difficult in human nature. We have a lot of, look at in America. I mean, there's a lot of division and tension that's under the surface. And there's no peace here. I don't think there's any peace elsewhere. We just have to contain the autocrats and the warlike individuals if we can. I don't know, you know, before communism fell, we basically had assured mutual destruction, which the Russians knew they wouldn't do this, and we knew that we wouldn't do that. We came very close during the Cuban Missile Crisis to crossing the border or line, and they backed off. Putin seems to think the Americans don't want any war. We've said that much, and we're not going to send troops. We've been in a 20-year war in Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't think we want any more war, so he's taking advantage of the situation. Don't forget, he thinks that the greatest disaster that the world has seen is the fall of communism. He feels like Gorbachev was a traitor. He despises Gorbachev. And he hates that they've lost all these colonies like Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. I don't know how far he's willing to go, and I certainly hope the Ukrainians really kind of stop him, at least wear him down. But it's hard to say that we can expect peace around the corner as long as you have people like Xi Jinping in China, and you have the dictator in North Korea, and you have Putin. And even in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, you have some fascist tendencies in Hungary and Poland. So it's just scary. The clock may be moving back one day, but it's moving the wrong way at the present time. A very frightening time. Very frightening time.
Positive note to end on?
No, the positive note is just to try to vote and make sure America stays on the right side. And I don't get political, but we had a very frightening 3 years, or 4 years rather. So anyway, thank you. Thank you.